Honestly, how did you make it this far in life thinking the Roman Empire was just a single vacation spot in Italy with a big broken stadium? Today, I'll explain the rise and fall of the Roman Empire to you like you're 5 years old. And by the end of this, you'll be able to confidently explain 1,000 years of history while your friends are still trying to figure out how to fold a fitted sheet. Let's start at the very beginning. Imagine a tiny little town in Italy. We'll call it Rome. It's not special, it's just a simple town. But the people who lived there were a little different. They were very ambitious. Think of them as the kids on the playground who aren't just playing foursquare. They're planning to take over the entire playground, then the park, and eventually the whole city block. At first, they had kings, just like in fairy tales. But one day they decided that they hated kings. They kicked their last king out and said, "Never again. No more single boss man for us." So, they created something called a republic. A republic is pretty much a fancy word for let's vote on stuff. It's like when your kindergarten class has to decide between playing with the big red ball or the blue bouncy balls. Instead of the teacher just deciding, everyone gets a say. Well, not everyone. In Rome, everyone mostly meant the rich guys who owned a lot of land. Now, these important guys were called senators, and they would meet in a big building to argue about things, which is what governments do best. They would elect 2 leaders, called consuls, to be in charge for 1 year. Why 2 leaders, you ask? Well, someone couldn't get too powerful and turn back into a king. It was honestly a pretty clever system for a while. I mean, this Roman Republic was all about teamwork, rules, and not letting one person get too bossy. So, how does a little town with a voting habit take over the world? Well, with a really, really good army. The Roman army was made up of groups called legions. A legion was like the most organized, toughest sports team you've ever seen. They had matching uniforms, excellent gear, and they practiced all the time. They were experts at 2 things, fighting and building. After they finished conquering a new place, they wouldn't just leave. They would build stuff. They built roads, bridges, and buildings to bring water into towns. Their roads were so good that some of them are still around today. I mean, imagine building a pillow fort so well that it's still standing when you're a grown-up. That's what the Romans did. So, the Republic started expanding. They'd fight a neighbor, win, and then tell the neighbor, "Okay, you're part of our club now, and you have to follow our rules and help us fight other people. But in return, we'll build you some pretty awesome roads and protect you from other bullies." It was a pretty good deal for a lot of people. So Rome continued to get bigger and bigger. They took over all of Italy. Then they looked across the sea and saw some other places to add to their club. So they fought some big wars, like the ones against a place called Carthage. Roman won, and they kept growing. And soon the Roman Republic wrapped around the entire Mediterranean Sea, which they called our sea. It's like they won the playground and then declared that the sandbox, the swings, and the water fountain were all theirs too. This is where the problems began to start. The Republic, the system designed for a small town, was now trying to run a giant chunk of the world. The rich senators got richer, and the poor soldiers who did all the fighting came home to find that they had no farms and no jobs. The system was breaking, and the teamwork was gone. The most popular and successful generals started acting like mini kings anyway, using their loyal armies to get what they wanted. Enter a guy named Julius Caesar. Now, you've probably heard of him. Caesar was a super popular, super successful general, and he was amazing at fighting, and his soldiers loved him. He conquered a huge area called Gaul, which is basically modern-day France, and he got so powerful and famous that the senators back in Rome got very, very nervous. They saw him and thought, "Uh-oh, that guy looks like he wants to be the one and only boss." They told him to come home without his army, and he thought about it and said, nah. He brought his army with him anyway, started a civil war, won, and basically became the boss of everything. Now, he never called himself a king, but if it looks like a king and acts like a king, well, you get the idea. The senators who hated kings really hated this. So they got together and in a very famous and messy moment, they got rid of him permanently. They thought they had saved the Republic, but they were wrong. All they did was create a power vacuum. So after more fighting, Caesar's adopted son, a clever young man named Octavian, came out on top. He learned from his dad's mistake. He knew that Romans hated the word king, so he said, "I'm not a king. I'm just the first citizen. I'm just here to help. But he took on a new name, Augustus, and he held all the real power. He was the commander of the army, he controlled all the money, and he made all the important decisions. He was a king in everything but name. He was the first Roman emperor, and that is when the Roman Republic officially died and the Roman Empire was born. And an empire, it's just what you call a really big area that's ruled by one person, an emperor. So, the Republic failed, but the empire that came next was, for a while, pretty great. The first 200 years of the Roman Empire were called the Pax Romana. It's a pretty fancy way of saying Roman peace, because there was one big boss, all the fighting inside Rome had stopped, and the emperor had a huge army to keep the borders safe from outsiders. The excellent roads they built were safe to travel on. You could go from one end of the empire to the other using the same money and speaking the same common languages. It was a great time of prosperity. They built amazing things like the Colosseum, where people would watch entertainment, and aqueducts that carried water for miles. The empire was huge, organized, and powerful. It was the undisputed champion of the world. The playground was finally peaceful because one really strong monitor was in charge of everything. But nothing lasts forever, especially not giant empires. And this is where we get to the fall part. It wasn't one single event, it was a very slow, messy process, like a toy breaking down over a long period of time. There were a bunch of reasons it fell apart. First, the empire was simply too big. It was a logistical nightmare. I mean, imagine trying to be the captain of a kickball team that has players in different cities. If a problem happens on one side of the empire, it would take weeks for the emperor to even hear about it, let alone send help. The playground had become so large that the monitor couldn't see what was happening by the distant fence. So to solve this, one emperor decided to split the empire in two. There would now be a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire, each with its own emperor. Yes, two. Because when something is cracking under its own weight, the most logical solution is to saw it in half. Second, they had some serious money problems. I mean, the Romans were spending a ton of money on their giant army to defend their giant borders. And to pay for it, they needed more gold and silver. And when they ran out of new places to conquer, well, the new money stopped flowing in. So the emperors came up with a brilliant, terrible idea. They started making new coins with less silver and gold in them, mixing in cheaper metals. It's like if you tried to pay for your candy with chocolate coins that were actually 90% dirt. And believe me, people aren't stupid. They knew the money was worth less, so they started charging more for things. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is called inflation, and it wrecked their economy. Third, they had a lot of trouble with outsiders. I mean, for centuries, the Romans had called the people living outside their borders barbarians, and this was just a word for anyone who wasn't Roman. For a long time, the Roman army was strong enough to keep these groups out, but as the empire got weaker and the army was busy fighting in civil wars, these groups saw their chance. They started pushing into the empire, sometimes raiding, sometimes looking for a place to settle. And this wasn't one giant invasion, it wasn't like water bursting through a wall. It was more like 1,000 leaks springing in a dam all at once. The playground fence was being rattled from all sides by kids who wanted in. Fourth, the leadership was a total disaster. After the good times of the Pax Romana, being the Roman emperor became a very dangerous job. I mean, everyone wanted to be the boss, and for a period of about 50 years, Rome had something like 26 different emperors, and almost all of them were murdered by their rivals. Just imagine having a new teacher every single week, each one with different rules and a high chance of being pushed down the stairs by the next week's teacher. It was complete chaos, and nobody knew who was in charge, and the government barely functioned. So, you have an empire that's simply too big to govern, with worthless money, and has constant attacks from the outside, plus a government that's a revolving door of murderers? It's a recipe for disaster. The Western Roman Empire, the half that included the city of Rome, crumbled first. It got weaker and weaker, and the final nail in the coffin happened in the year 476 AD, when the last Roman emperor in the West was kicked out by a Germanic chieftain. It wasn't a big, fiery explosion, it was more like an old building that had been rotting for a century finally having its last wall fall down. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, actually kept going for another 1,000 years. They were still Romans, but they spoke Greek and were a bit different. So when people talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, they're usually talking about the fall of the western part, the one that started it all. So, there you have it. The Romans started as a small town that hated kings, they created a voting system called a republic, built an incredible army that was great at fighting and building, and took over most of their known world. Then their system broke because it was simply too small for their giant playground. So they got an emperor, a single boss, which worked great for a while, leading to a long peace. But eventually, the empire got too big, their money became worthless, outsiders started breaking in, and their leaders were too busy fighting each other to fix anything. The western half fell apart, leaving behind its laws, its language, and its amazing roads for everyone else to find. It's like they built the biggest, most complicated Lego castle ever. It was amazing for a long time. But then the bricks started to get loose, and some of the builders started knocking down each other's towers. And eventually, the whole thing just sort of slumped into a pile of pieces. You see, you totally get it now. I mean, you're practically a historian. Now go. Explain it all to someone else.